Hey people, I want to talk to you about natural stones today. I really feel like my sharpening was improved a lot by including some of these in my repertoire, and I don't think it's all that difficult to start using them. It can be a little intimidating, and there's a lot of terminology and especially Japanese words that make it seem like it's a very strict and demanding type of activity, and it can be if you want, but if you're looking at it from a more utilitarian standpoint, it's not any more difficult really than using synthetic stones. There's a couple guidelines you want to follow, and I think some things that are important to understand about the stones when selecting the stone to make sure that it's appropriate for your knife. Real quickly, natural stones are essentially all abrasive, and their fineness and cutting ability is dictated both by the fineness of the little particles in them, which are more plate-like shaped. They're more like little flakes than the grit of a synthetic stone. The hardness, or how compacted the stone is, will also affect its characteristics. So the fineness and the hardness are important to understand when choosing a stone. So if you're looking for a stone for a razor, you want a really hard, fine stone that's going to give you, a crazy sharp edge for a razor. However, that same stone would kind of do a lousy job on a lot of knives. So a little bit softer stones typically are better for the knives. I wanted to show you some stones from Iwatani and Shirogami mines. And these are analogous to other mines as well. It's easy to get lost in the details with this stuff, but I think that if you follow a couple general techniques and a couple general ideas here, it's easy to get started with natural stones. One thing that keeps a lot of people away from natural stones is the cost. Some natural stones can be quite expensive. Ones that are very large and homogeneous, big bench stone, or larger than this, can get into the many hundreds of dollars. For a lot of people, a great way to start are with smaller kind of offcut or just smaller stones that are called kopa. And a lot of these kopa stones are really have the same cutting ability and are just as good functionally as the larger stones. They're just going to wear out a little quicker, or some of them are quite small, but this is a stone that's $48 or $34 or $108. So, once the faces get a little bigger, they start to get a little more expensive. But a stone like this is going to outlast a synthetic stone. So, being that they're essentially all abrasive, they last a really long time. One thing that we like to do with most of our kind of more premium stones that we're grading individually is give them a hardness and a fineness, and this is a scale of 1 to 5, and typically we're not dealing, 1 being the softest or coarsest, and 5 being the hardest and finest. Typically we're finding the stones that we're selecting to be somewhere in the 3 to 4 range of hardness and 3 to 4 range of fineness. Sometimes the hardness and the fineness will correlate and they'll be similar to each other, but there are stones that are exceptions to this. Typically, the softer stones are going to be a little easier to use for beginners. So something that's 3 or 3.5 is a pretty easy to use stone. We'll usually note this as well, and we like to use a little dropper of water. Some people use spray bottles. That's okay. You don't want to soak your natural stones, though. They can delaminate. Most of the stones we get have lacquer on the sides. This keeps them from falling apart over time. But these are sedimentary stones, so there's a bedding layer of planes in the stones. Some are very nice and fat, like this one. Others, there's there might be little inclusions, or there might be kind of some little seams and stuff like that, and they're always priced accordingly. You can quickly gauge how soft or hard a stone is by how fast the water is absorbed into it. You can either take like this is a pop-up sponge here that we just kind of wipe the surface with, and I'm seeing how quickly that water is getting drawn into the face of the stone. Doing this and blowing on the stone can let you find if there's any little seams, any little cracks in the stone. It's not uncommon to find little seams, and sometimes it's just something you're gonna live with. You might have to re-glue a piece. Some really thin stones that have seams going through them, you'll get a good deal on it. It'll just need to get glued down onto a piece of wood to keep it stable. But this is a good way to kind of quickly assess what's the hardness of the stone. And here we can see a couple little shallow lines starting to show. Those would be little seams. Now I'm going to look on the side, see if I can't notice it going further down. Quite often there'll be little shallow cracks on the face that don't extend more than a couple millimeters. And you know, when we find that kind of stuff, we always price accordingly. Occasionally you'll see a dark line on a stone. If that line catches light and reflects back to you, if it has a kind of dark metallic look to it, that might be a mineralized or toxic line that could cause you problems. To discern whether that's going to be a problem or not, or whether it's just the way the stone looks, take a knife and go along that little line and see if you feel the edge of the knife catch on it. If you hear a little scratchy noise when your blade hits the edge of that line, that's a toxic line that needs to be scratched out. You can scratch it out with like a little nail or a ice pick, some little thing just to scratch that out. If we find those also, we will lower the price as well. Trying to avoid them, but sometimes a stone will be perfectly useful once that little toxic inclusion is removed, but not every dark line is a toxic inclusion. So there's lots of names for the different appearances of the stones. I'm not going to get into this in this video. It really isn't as important for learning to use the stones to know all the names of all the different colors of them as well. The colors of the stones typically do not affect the performance of the stone, although some light colored stones are preferred, and some people get the impression that a light colored stone works faster because there's more contrast from the swarf that comes up. So it looks like more metal has come up because on a darker stone, the dark metal in the slurry is a little bit hidden by the surface of the appearance of the stone. So this is a little shobudani here that is, I like having stones that have some height to them. This is gonna last like decades of heavy use. So, this doesn't need a base right away. Sometimes I will take a lapping plate to the bottom face of these stones to help if they wobble a little bit. These little pads, this is a little piece of like a kind of felty towel that I cut up, and it makes a great little base. Even if the base of the stone's not perfectly flat, it doesn't wobble with that softer base under it. So softer stones are going to soak up the water a little bit quicker. Once you get started with working on a slightly softer stone, once you start working just with water, you'll see a little bit of mud and metal or swarf start to come up. So here's like a real kind of good example of a kind of even mix of swarf and the mud from the stone. Little bits of the stone starting to come up. This is a real easy stone to use. We graded this one at about 3 to 3.5 hardness. These gradings are all very subjective. So I think that for a knife sharpener, I'm looking at wanting stones that are better for knives. So the way that I grade a stone, I might grade this to be a little bit harder than a razor sharpener who's just focused on razor stones. They might think that this is too soft for a razor and therefore just be inclined just to grate it a little bit softer. So it is a little subjective. So it's always taken into account who's telling you what it is. But I'm starting to use this now with a little less water and less pressure. So I let a little bit of that water dry up, and you can see here this is not as wet of a surface. The mud's a little bit more pasty. This is going to, on a stone that allows it, not all do this, but on many stones, this is going to start getting a little bit finer. Many stones will allow you to get several different types of finish out of the stone with a lot of water, and by a lot I mean a good wet surface, layer of water over the whole surface, and a longer stroke with more pressure, kind of like how you'd use a synthetic stone. This typically will give you a slightly coarser polish than if we were to use a little of the mud that had already been generated and use very light pressure and smaller strokes, rolling over that drying mud. This will create a finer texture quite often in that mud as those particles are breaking up as we're sharpening. The particles of a natural stone typically are more friable than the particles of a synthetic stone, which again are a little bit more like a set sandy grit. Here we're dealing with little flakes that can crumble apart as we use them, and clumps of flakes. So this is a medium soft stone, and a much softer stone would be generating tons of mud while we're working, and we might see more mud than swarf. It might be a little bit lighter colored mud that's being generated during sharpening. Typically those kinds of stones would give you a finish that's maybe more analogous to like a 4,000 grit synthetic. You can't really say this is a 4,000 finish or this natural stone is 10,000 grit. They just don't work that way. They're not graded like that, and because you get a range of finishes, typically it's pretty inaccurate. So it's an analogy, but it's not the best. Harder stones like this Iwatani, this one needs a little more finesse. It's a little more difficult to use, and there's some other techniques that are going to be necessary to get good results out of this one. Sometimes these harder stones don't get along with real high alloy steels. So if you have a stone that feels like it has like a foreign grit on it, it feels scratchy, and you're sharpening a knife that has a high alloy content in it, the knife and stone just might not get along. But before you determine that and stop using that knife on that stone, there's a couple things you could try. First is a Nagara, and this is a different type of natural stone. There's a couple different coarsenesses of the Nagara, but if you rub a little bit onto the surface of your stone, and you can see if the Nagara or the base stone is harder by the color of the mud that's generated. If the color of the mud is that's generated is more similar to the color of your Nagara, then your Nagara is a little bit softer than the base stone you're using. Vice versa, if the color of this mud is quite a bit darker than your Nagara, or more the color of the host stone, then you can see that your host stone is a little bit softer. But this mud here is going to be a little bit coarser than the base stone here. Once we start sharpening with this, we'll start to pull off a little bit of mud from the host stone, and the mud will begin to get a little bit finer cutting. So let's see how this one does. And I'm working with Shirogami. Shirogami is great for using with our natural stones, and this is where you really appreciate this steel. You can get a huge variety of finishes on a well-done Shirogami. Shirogami is oftentimes less expensive than Aogami, but it's more difficult to get really good results with. So, you know, a lot of blacksmiths kind of, I think, appreciate the steel maybe a little more than some users that are trying to avoid sharpening. If you're trying to avoid sharpening, then Shirogami might not be the right steel for you. So now, once I started sharpening with the mud that was generated from our Nagara and the host stone, it's cutting much quicker, it's much easier to use. So for this slightly harder stone, and this is one that we graded at level 4, it's a little bit higher than the one that we were just using. This is going to be a stone that benefits from use of Nagara. One thing that I think is really important to consider when you're choosing an edge from either a natural or a synthetic stone is the type of edge that the finished stone will give your knife. Some knives are going to benefit from a super fine, you know, almost razor-like kind of finish, and others would feel washed out and dull really quickly with that kind of finish. So finer is not always sharper, and the cutting duration can be really improved by getting the right amount of tooth. So some knives need a lot of tooth and they're going to feel dull even though they'd be quite sharp and would do, you know, some of the tests like cutting paper or, you know, any of those things. You might find that a knife that's doing that might not perform in the way that you want. So ask questions and don't just, you know, pick one edge and stick with it. You know, try a couple different edges, see what the cutting duration is like. Okay, so as we can see here, this mud is starting to dry up. This is a combination of the Nagara and the host stone. And I'm just going to use this little bit to get a little bit finer finish. And so that definitely gives me a different look and finish. Another good thing to have on hand for real hard stones is a Tomo Nagara. This means a friend Nagara. It means that, you know, it's typically, in a strict term, this would be an offcut of the same stone. So sometimes we call these Tomo-ish Nagara because these are kind of random natural stone offcuts that we'll use like this Nagara, but it usually will give you a little bit finer mud than the mud that you get from a Nagara. And again, on harder stones, generating a little bit of mud beforehand is really helpful if the stone won't generate its own mud just with water and the knife running over the surface of it. If you feel that the surface of the stone feels gritty, this can be an indication that your knife isn't getting along. So some hard stones just aren't good knife stones, and some knives don't get along with all hard stones. And let's take a look at what it's like to sharpen on a small stone like this. I feel that natural stones, the way that you use them, it allows for using a much smaller stone than with synthetics. Synthetics, the way that they're typically used, a little stone like this, I don't think would be all that great to use. But being that we're operating with smaller strokes on naturals, quite often these little stones work perfectly well if we're careful. The biggest thing to keep in mind is that you always want to keep your fingers over the area of stone you're working on for safety. You don't want your fingers slipping and getting cut from it getting pinched in between the blade and the stone. This one looks like it's pretty soft because the water I put on already got absorbed into it. And I'm just going to get started. You want to have enough clearance for your hand here, so that's important. If you're working with one that's really narrow, this will need to get glued onto a surface. So here I'm starting with more water and more pressure, and it's removing some metal pretty quickly. Actually, this one's cutting fairly fast. Now I'm going to start lightening up on the pressure and working in smaller, kind of choppier strokes. But I'm always keeping my fingers over the stone as I'm working. And this is really important. You don't want your fingers going over the end of the stone and coming back in here where they could get guillotined. And this stone is definitely making a kind of hazier, rougher polish than the last hard stone that I had been using before it. So there's a different kind of finish that's being laid down. But it still looks pretty nice. If I wanted to see if this this little copa could be graded a little bit finer, I would allow this mud to sit on the surface of the stone and let it dry for a minute. Okay, we've let this dry out a little bit, and this mud that was previously really liquid is starting to get a little bit thicker here. It's just been air drying. I'm gonna see if this is going to cut any finer than how it did previously. And again, I'm using a lot less pressure and really small strokes. And let's see if this did any. I'm not seeing much difference. It looks like it cuts kind of the same. So some stones you can grade to cut finer. Others kind of do what they do. Usually it's the softer ones that kind of do what they do, and they kind of have one cutting power. Many of the harder ones, you can get a couple different levels, especially with what you generate your mud with. So I hope that kind of helps you get started a little bit. Definitely feel like natural stones are a really great thing to include if you're sharpening handmade Japanese knives, and you know, you're only using like one synthetic stone. You might be missing out on different personalities that you could be pulling out of that knife. And that's something that really is great, you know, about Shirogami. It's a real kind of simple alloy. There's not a lot else included into it to pre-engineer any kind of characteristics, but with the finish that you put onto it, you can get lots of different edges and cutting feels. And that can be done with lots of different steels as well. So, you know, definitely encourage you to experiment and dip your toe in the water if you've made it this far. All right, thanks for watching.